Right. So, one of the reasons I was keen to host this program is that in our time, Homer and Ovid have been and continue to be, I would argue, the most influential composers of verbal art from the ancient world. And consequently, we have perhaps grown so accustomed to seeing them yoked together, to seeing episodes from their epics stitched together into single narratives, that we can forget they're separated by hundreds of years and emerged from very different storytelling traditions. Homer, as we know, dates to the Archaic period, though the text of his epics that we have received came largely out of Hellenistic Alexandria via classical Athens. What we have received as texts of his epics originated in and were transmitted through a largely oral culture, gradually becoming more fixed as Greek culture transitioned into a literate phase. And of course, there's overlap in these things. And this is to say that Homer was not in the Archaic period transmitted through manuscripts, but through oral tellings. So notably, about Homer, we have no reliable biographical information, only a series of anecdotes that have few shared details, right, details in common. And those two details are that Homer was blind and Homer was impoverished. If Homer ever existed as a quote unquote real man, this name, Homer, was also the figurehead. It was attached to a tradition that enfolded a range of song traditions. So these are important things that actually bear on how we interpret the epics. Ovid, which I'm going to leave it to Freddie to give us most of our Ovid information, but just a few things, right, was composing in imperial Rome, by which time a manuscript tradition existed. Roman poets may have been hearing stories about Greek myths. They may have experienced them in recitation, but texts of the myths also existed that were attached to historical figures. So again, though they were both perhaps experienced orally, Aurally, Homer in the context would have been in the context of festivals in honor of gods and heroes, public community events that also had a civic component, but were also had a sacred component. Now, my contention is that these distinctions are critical ones that we have to reckon with if we're going to engage with these epics in good faith. And I suggest that it's important to do so not only because these epics are worthy of respect, but so that we can better understand why these epics are worthy of respect, why we still read them today, what wisdom they still have to impart. And I would add that practicing the skills of good faith dialogue with the epics provides an object lesson in engaging in good faith with each other as well. And this is a skill that I do feel is especially essential in our contemporary world that is so multicultural and so multilingual. Right, so in the time that we have together, Freddie and I are going to discuss three topics of shared concern: episodic structure, orality and literacy, and memory. And then, of course, we'll open up the dialogue to everyone. And I promise to get the ball rolling by saying a few words about episodic structure in Homer. And I'm going to do it through an episode from book 16, which is the death of Sarpedon. When Patroclus is facing off with Sarpedon, Zeus, who is Sarpedon's father, does not want to let him die. He says, hey, let's think about this for a minute. You know, maybe we could let Sarpedon live. And Hera intervenes to remind him of the consequences of overriding fate. If he decides to save his son, then all the gods will want to do likewise, and this could cause an uprising, instability, chaos. So instead, Hera instructs him to have Apollo bring Sarpedon's body back to Lycia for a hero's burial. If you really want things to go the way they need to go, you're going to have to let Sarpedon die. And Zeus complies and sends Apollo to bring Sarpedon back to his people for burial. If we think about this episode, the death of Sarpedon, in the context of plot, how does the plot of the whole poem progress? It can feel unnecessary to the story of Achilles' rage. If we think the Iliad is the story of Achilles' rage, then do we really need to know about this random side guy? You know, what's it doing? Theoretically, you could remove it and the plot could still unfold. But if we think about the episode in the context of the meaning of Homeric epics, which is to transmit what ancient Greek speakers needed to remember about gods and heroes, then we could look at this episode as revealing a central dynamic about the cosmos that is repeatedly conveyed in each narrative, each episode, each episode in the larger narrative. And that is For stability to be maintained, all the powers of the cosmos have to be in balance. And this includes even the leader or father of them all, Zeus. Zeus cannot just exert his will no matter what, right? No matter what the consequences, because he may not like those consequences. And certainly, if there is instability, then everybody will suffer. So heroes must be allowed to die, but they must also be given their portion of honor. And that episode of Sarpedon's death, again, replicates, emphasizes the same pattern that unfolds over and over and over again in each of the individual episodes that make up the whole. So it's not necessarily about the plot, the rage of Achilles, but it's the meaning. What is the rage of Achilles? This divine rage that Achilles experiences and the destructive force of it. What is it telling us about what we need to remember about heroes and gods? So that was my encapsulation of the meaning of episodic structure in Homer. That episodic structure is about constantly reinforcing the meaning and being able to get to the whole through the part. So any one episode, you could extract it from the epic and you could get to the bigger meaning through it. So that's you now, Freddie.
That's me now. Thank you. So I was just thinking about that. That's really fascinating, actually. So am I going to just completely rip up my script and
No.
talk about what you've just said? But it's interesting actually because when I was previously with you, I sort of discussed how the Metamorphoses sort of moves in 15 books of epic poetry from the creation of the universe to Ovid's own era. But the way it does that, as it sort of freely moves from episode to episode, is often sort of turbulent and chaotic, and it obscures this sort of any clear sort of visible chronological structure. And it sort of jumps around in time and space through storytelling, internal narration, and so on and so forth. Although it's sort of important, I think, to point out that internal narration is a feature of the epic tradition, not least in Homer and Virgil. But this idea that you talked about how taking individual episodes and how they sort of then reinforce a meaning that the poem has is a really interesting one, because Ovid's Metamorphoses, although it's a very different beast, does exactly the same in the sense that you have all these episodes that are stitched together. There's no teleology like there is in Homer, or Virgil for that matter. But what there is this sort of reflection on the process of metamorphosis, sorry. And so you do get that sense of distilling down to this these acts of abrupt change, which then inform us about important aspects about what it is to be human, for instance, one's identity. What is the value of humanity relative to other features of the natural world? Death, for instance, death is such a central aspect of the Iliad. It's sort of constantly the shadow that sort of that haunts everybody, and yet in the Metamorphoses, sort of these transformations, they, in a way, it's death avoidance. So I'll just say those things. But what I was going to do, I mean, I could talk about the Metamorphoses more generally, but what I'm going to do is actually specifically focus on the bits in which Ovid engages with Homer most directly. I think his treatment of the Trojan War is where he looks at these themes of memory and poetic memory, so that the way people remember, but also the literary tradition that he has to work with. And those two are fused, basically. It's very difficult to disentangle them. Now, as I was sort of preparing this talk, it was really clear to me that that I could have swapped around the section I'm going to talk about memory and the section I'm going to talk about literacy. I could swap those around, basically, because I'm essentially talking about the same thing. So, but for this thing, so as I say, these episodes are sort of loosely structured, and there's no teleology around it, and it's basically fitting around this just huge narrative arc, the largest narrative arc imaginable, basically. And so the Trojan War obviously he has to deal with it. He has to deal with it because it's an important event of great magnitude, both in the literary imagination and historically as a universal marker that existed in the borderlands of the mythical and the historical. But to get to Rome, he has to deal with the Trojan War. But how does he do that? Um, if you there's if you think about how you deal with a literary tradition, you have what's maybe the anxiety of influence, which is a phrase that's often used. How do you cope with the burden of having to rewrite Homer, and as importantly, having to rewrite Virgil, which for Roman epic poets was a massive issue, basically. Or is it a case of being bold and brave and creating something completely new? And you just sort of almost two fingers up at the Homeric tradition and say, look, I'm going to write something completely different. And I say this because I'm going to go through, for those of you who aren't familiar with his treatment of the Trojan War, I'm just going to go through the episodes that he talks about. Basically, he deals his treatment of the Iliad, one could say, is an act of avoidance, basically. And you can even see this in the first reference to the war is in book 11, and he talks about this the story of this person called Aeacus, who is Hector's brother, who transforms into a bird that plunges into the sea. And this episode's told by an unnamed old man, and it includes a reference to Priam, Aeacus's father, as the king who, Ovid says, oversaw by fate Troy's last days. And that's 11, lines 757 to 8. So in Ovid's account, the war is treated as over even before his description of it has begun. And this is basically how he deals with this event. It sort of casts its shadow over the metamorphoses well before he actually talks about it. You get a sense in the earlier books that something big is coming. In book 7, you get a account of the creation of the Myrmidons from ants. These then go on to become Achilles' army in the Trojan War. Book 10, you have a description of Zeus's rape of the Trojan prince Ganymede. In book 11, we have an account, quite a lengthy account, of the early Trojan king Laomedon and the foundation of Troy with the help of Neptune and Apollo, who he then double crosses with terrible consequences for his city and his family. And then also in book 11, you get an account of Peleus's marriage to Thetis, who results in a child who will become the focus of the war, Achilles. And this is a story that's referenced in book 24 of the Iliad, in poems of the epic cycle, the Cypria primarily, and it's also the subject of Catullus's mini-epic, poem 64. So the war proper begins from book 12 onwards, and it starts with the Greek fleet assembling at Aulis and the sacrifice of Agamemnon's daughter Iphigenia to appease Artemis or Diana, right? And this is a story which features heavily in the Greek tragic corpus, not least Euripides. And then after this digression, which I'm going to talk about in a bit, about on the Palace of Fame, the next major episode sort of involves a combat between Achilles and Cygnus, right? Now, is this story in the Iliad? I don't think so. It's a story that appears in the Cypria. Again, this is an epic cycle poem. So these epic cycle poems are sort of ancient epics that sort of maybe fill the gaps in the sort of Homeric corpus. Maybe I might be corrected on that. Anyway, but Cygnus has this feature. He's granted invulnerability from weapons. So already we start sort of to see this deconstruction of the Homeric epic model. You have a warrior who doesn't have to rely on his weapons. He's granted this invulnerability through his father, and it's only when he's about to be strangled by Achilles, who turns into this sort of beast type figure, that Poseidon, Neptune, turns him into a swan. And then there's a pause in the war, right? And then the Greek chiefs tell each other stories. But these stories are temporarily located in a period well before the war. So we have Nestor, who's the sort of the man who lived for hundreds and hundreds of years. He can remember back. And so he tells us a story about Caenis, a girl who becomes Caeneus, a man. which is in Hesiod, and also in the Netflix series Chaos, which I recommend everybody should watch. And like Cygnus, he's also, as Cainius, he's also invulnerable. And then we have the mock epic battle, which takes up 300 lines between the Lapis and the Centaurs during a wedding feast. This is briefly told by Nestor in Iliad Book 1, and Cainius took part in that, and then he transforms at the very end into a bird. So this is a story that has nothing to do with the Trojan War per se, and yet it is the centerpiece of the treatment. You know, the way in which Ovid displays his ability to write epic warfare, as it were. And then Nestor tells the story of the death of Periclymenus, Nestor's brother, at the hand of Hercules, who was ransacking Nestor's home city of Pylos. So, and these pre-Iliadic stories curiously take up the bulk of Ovid's treatment, because the next episode describes Achilles' death, prompted by a vengeful Neptune and delivered by Paris with the help of Apollo. This is in book 12, and it closes book 12. And this is an episode which doesn't appear in the Iliad, but is predicted with some degree of precision by Hector as he's dying in book 22. And also in book 24 of the Odyssey, the shades of Agamemnon and Achilles converse, and then they reference the latter's death, but not the details, which are accounted for elsewhere in the literary tradition. Another epic cycle, a poem called the Ethiopis. So what we have here is a huge temporal leap, moving the story from the beginning to almost the end of the war, and it is centered on a single act of retribution, with certain elements that take place in between sort of referenced, but only obliquely via internal narration. For example, when Poseidon, or when Neptune, sorry, approaches Apollo to discuss Achilles' death, he briefly references how Achilles had dragged Hector's dead body 3 times round Troy. So that's in book 12, lines 590 to 1, and in the Iliad, it's in book 22, that scene. So with Achilles dead, the narrative in book 13 then moves on to an extended description of the contest for Achilles' weapons and armor, in which Ajax and Ulysses, Odysseus, give speeches to their fellow chiefs supporting their claim to the arms. And the judgment was part of the epic cycle tradition, as well as the Greco-Roman tragic corpus, right? And these speeches give an opportunity for Ovid to deal with major episodes that take place in the Trojan War, which readers would be familiar with. For instance, Palamedes, the treachery or his framing of Palamedes, leaving Philoctetes on Lemnos, for instance, and so on and so forth. So again, they're dealt within sort of internal narration. They're sort of not dealt with as part of the main narrative. The judgment is lost by Ajax, and that leads to his suicide and the transformation of his blood into a hyacinth. And then the actual fall of Troy is described in just one line. Book 13, 404, Troia simul Priamus quae cadent. Troy and Priam fall together. Before we then move on to the aftermath very quickly, Hecuba becomes the focus. The sacrifice of her daughter Polyxena to appease Achilles' ghost, and the murder of her son Polydorus by the Thracian king Polymestor, who was tasked with looking after him. And here we're firmly in the world of Greek tragedy, Euripides' Hecuba, and Ovid is faithful to the tragic poet in his treatment of this story. So the final episode before Ovid turns to Aeneas and does his particular treatment on the Aeneid, he involves the Ethiopian king Memnon's involvement in the war. And this is actually quite similar to Sarpedon, I think, in many respects. Memnon dies in battle. He's killed by Achilles. His mother, Aurora, grieves for him. And so Jupiter makes it that the ashes on Memnon's funeral pyre become birds which engage in savage fighting. And this version is not attested anywhere else. Although Memnon is the subject of the epic cycle poem, the Ethiopis, where Eos successfully entreats Zeus to bestow immortality for her dead son. So slightly opposite to what happens with Sarpedon, I think. So what you have here basically is someone who gives an account of the Trojan War and yet doesn't give an account of the Trojan War. And each of these episodes can almost stand on their own 2 feet without the other episodes. There is none of the stitching, none of the plot that you have with Homer. You have these individual episodes, they're drawn from all manner of sources, but they also show, as I think when we're going to talk about memory and I'm going to talk about literacy, they also show a really acute understanding of what's going on in the Homeric poems without actually talking about those Homeric poems sort of directly. So I hope that sort of gives you a sense of the structure. I think it's really important to understand that when Ovid talks about the Trojan War, it's not the Trojan War as we would understand it, basically.
Yeah, I mean, this is why it's difficult to have a script in any kind of dialogue, because now there's so many interesting points that you bring up about Ovid. The one thing that I think actually, this is a perfect segue into memory, because so one of the things that again seems really different if we look at the Aethiopus and what happens with Memnon and what happens to Sarpedon in the Iliad, again on a plot level it's very different, because in the Aethiopus we have Dawn requesting the immortalization of her son, whereas in the Iliad it's the wife of Zeus, and I should add that he is, one of his epithets is husband of Hera in the Iliad. She is instructing him what to do to allow Sarpedon to die, but then to be immortalized. And that's the sticky issue, is what exactly is Dawn asking and what is Hera suggesting? And are these as different as they seem on a pure plot point, right? A plot element. And I would argue, and again, this is something I would ask more broadly, because I know some of you also have done a lot of work with Homer, Mariana. um, are they actually really asking for the same thing? Because is the mortal body of the hero going to die in both cases? Like, what does the immortalization actually mean when we're talking about heroes? And of course, Homer is not actually talking about the cult hero, very elegantly gets around ever naming the cult hero, but the word Eros appears very few but significant times, and if I'm not mistaken, always of a hero who is close to death. So we are aware of the cult hero, meaning the hero who is worshipped in the historical present of classical Athens and archaic Greece, right? But Homer isn't overtly talking about that. Homer's talking about the dynamic, right? The journey of the hero, the facing of death, and then the allusion to this afterlife of the hero, the power that the hero will have to his people or her people. And that's the memory that Homer is holding. It's giving you this paradigm. What do we need to remember about gods? What do we need to remember about heroes? What do we need to remember about the way the world works, the cosmos works, the sense of balance, making sure everybody gets their portion of honor. And it's holding it's giving you that paradigm, and then you can stitch yourself as a local community into that paradigm. You can find your local traditions. You can talk about your cult heroes. You can see the pattern and how your cult hero relates to heroes broadly. So I hope I've kind of addressed that element, right? If anyone has questions, we'll open it in the end. So on a plot level, the epic cycle is giving you giving you all these different little stories, little versions. It's giving you more of like the human. It's giving you a way to connect as a human, right? Memnon has a mother. His mother has these concerns. It's just a slightly different way, but they're actually talking about the same thing, I think, in the end. it comes down to the same thing, which is they are heroes, meaning they will die in the mortal world, but they will be eternal. And when we're told that Sarpedon's people will make a tomb to him and they'll give him his portion of honor, they'll give him his funeral rites, that's the signal, the sign that, oh, okay, Sarpedon will be worshipped by the Lycians. He will retain his power, his eternal power will be invoked by his own people who can connect to him because they'll have his remains. And so when they pour libations, when they make sacrifices, they will connect with the eternal psyche, all right, spirit of Sarpedon. Something else that you mentioned that was really interesting to me. Yeah, the fact that Ovid does not deal with Homeric things, the Homeric narrative specifically, but kind of dances around them by going to the epic cycle. And I think this is really interesting because, of course, by the time we get to Hellenistic Alexandria, Homer's name is only attached to the Iliad and Odyssey. And Homer is seen as a voice of divine authority. Like, we've got to figure out what's truly Homeric. We need to, because this is the thing we need to really remember. It's these Homeric things that are important, these Homeric things that are divine, they're sacred, need to be remembered. So it's interesting that Ovid goes, like sort of around that is interesting to me. Maybe not touching the sacred knowledge of the Greeks, but kind of taking the stories from the cycle. And then the third thing that I just wanted to mention, where was that? I was keeping notes as you were talking. Oh goodness, I think I've lost it. Well, anyway, all right. So I'll let you kind of educate us about memory in Ovid.
Okay. So again, sort of lots of things that I'd like to pick up on there. So first of all, I think one of the really interesting things for me is that, and you talk about why he sort of leans towards the epic cycle and maybe skirts around some of the Homeric material, and it's not least because if you go back, if you think of another Roman poet, Horace, he talks in his Art of Poetry, he criticizes those poets who sort of give this massive account of the Trojan War, and they start from the birth of Helen, from an egg and so on and so forth. He says, no, you have to sweep through into the middle, into the midst of the action, and so on and so forth. That's a little bit of that anxiety of influence. How do we deal with someone who is, as you say, a sort of divine authority? But also, I think it comes down to something else, which is fundamental, really. So Homer in the Iliad and the Odyssey, it's all about death and how you deal with death. But in the Metamorphoses, you can avoid death by changing. It's a different, I mean, it's still a poem that is really interested in death, but you can change and you can postpone your death as a human and become something else. And the question is whether what you become is worse or better than what you were before. So that's a fundamental thing, I think. And then that feeds into your question, what does immortalization mean, basically? Um,
Mm.
you know, and Ovid's really, he's sort of thinking about memory. Ovid really understands how memory works in Homer, I would say. His treatment is a reflection or a meditation on Homeric memory, but it's also on how and what we remember, sort of more generally. And in many respects, he sort of reconfigures sort of Homeric memory. The section is obsessed with tombs, right? You were talking about tombs. The very first tomb is a tomb for this person who I talked about, Isaacus, who hadn't died, but Priam thought he'd died. And so they conduct these these rites around a tomb that is a false tomb because Isaacus is still alive as a bird, right? And then it prefigures another tomb. It prefigures Achilles' tomb, right, after he dies. And then there's Memnos' funeral pyre. And then and right at the end, there's Ovid's own epitaph for his own poem, which is almost like a tomb in itself, right? He's really interested in this. But I'm gonna, if I may, and I don't want to sort of eat up the time, but there's these lines in book 12 after Achilles has died that I think are really interesting, and I want to talk about them. And I'm going to talk about them in depth, which means I'm going to read them out. And I'm going to use Stephanie McCarter's, I don't know if you can see this, her translation. It's fab. I would read it if I were you. So in book 12, and now Achilles, dread of Trojans, glory and guardian of the Greeks, unbeaten warrior, had burned, cremated by that god who'd armed him, Hephaestus or Vulcan. He's ash, and all that's left of great Achilles could barely fill a little urn. And yet his glory lives and fills the whole wide world. This is a proper measure of that man. In this respect, he's still the same Achilles and has no sense of empty Tartarus. So these lines, just a handful of lines, just capture so many meanings. And I think it's really important to understand how Ovid engages with Homer and how Ovid and Homer are sort of different. Sort of first, there's the way it appears to reinforce this idea of Homeric kleos, Homeric glory through memory. The glorious memory of Achilles will live on even after his death, and it will touch the entire world. And this isn't a prediction, it's a reality, basically. It's one of those fake futures that you get in poetry. And this is amplified by the titles he's given: the dread of Trojans, the guardians of the Greeks. He's also called Iacides, which is not translated by McCarter. He's called an unbeaten warrior, which is literally the unsurpassed leader in war. But then he starts to unpick all of that, the memory of Achilles. For he says that the god who made him immune, gave him this reputation via his armor, which is Hephaestus, Vulcan, was the one, as a proxy for fire, who burnt his dead body. So he's not so immune from death. After all, Vulcan is both the life giver and he's the taker away of physical life. And despite Achilles' extraordinary reputation, he can still be reduced to a small pile of physical ashes that cannot even fill an urn. If you remember in the Odyssey, when Achilles meets Odysseus, Achilles regrets his choice that he made. He says, I'd much rather be a lowly servant than the lord of all the dead. So maybe that small pile of physical ashes is important after all. And maybe the reputation isn't as important as he thought it would be in the Iliad. I'm also going to talk about maybe also the literacy of this passage, because there's two Homeric passages that are worth considering here. The first, in Iliad book 23, lines 62 to 107, the ghost of Patroclus visits Achilles in a dream, and he asks that the proper funeral rites for him be carried out so he can enter the underworld, and most importantly, that they be buried together, for Achilles' own death will come soon. And this episode centers on the backstory of how they were brought up together as children. And this causes Achilles great distress, for it reminds him of this fated choice that he had to make. And then a second Homeric reference occurs in the Odyssey, book 24, when during a conversation between the shades of Agamemnon and Achilles in the underworld, Agamemnon describes how a single golden urn handed to the Greeks by his mother Thetis was used to contain the remains of them both, Achilles and Patroclus. This was then housed in a magnificent tomb overlooking the Hellespont. Part of what Agamemnon promised him would be his great fame, his kleos eslon among men. That's line 94. So the interesting point is this: aside from Ovid's deep understanding of the Homeric text, for Achilles' story, his reputation, his kleos, his memory to make sense, you need someone else. You need Patroclus. You need the doppelganger who dies wearing his armor. The latter completes the former physically because he's the one who fills the urn, And from a narrative perspective, he's as important as Achilles, because without him, Achilles is half empty, despite the glory of his reputation. His story, the memory of him, is half told. Patroclus, as the not quite invincible Achilles, amplifies Achilles' invulnerability. Even this is not enough to prevent his death at the hands of the gods via Paris. And then you have this reference to Tartarus at the end, which reminds the reader of the encounter that I just talked about. So there's all sorts of resonances here that go back to Homer. It shows a really acute understanding of the Homeric texts, and yet is able to sort of meditate on what they mean. And then, you know, and it sort of deals with this issue of death. It also with this issue of what does immortalization mean? Because this is also a section that is probably one of the most intense moments when Ovid thinks about what death means. Because normally, as I said before, you can avoid your own death by changing into something else, and this is what Cygnus and Caeneus do in his Iliadic treatment. They do not die like Homeric warriors die, basically. And then you have this other section that happens in book 13 once the war is over. Achilles suddenly pops up from out of the grave and he says, "Greeks, you leave forgetful of me. Is your thanks for my manly valor buried with me? Don't do this. So my tomb won't be unhonored. Sacrifice Polyxena, let her propitiate Achilles' ghost." So even as a ghost, Ovid's Achilles suffers from memory anxiety. For him, Homeric glory by the memory of his deeds is not secure. He's fearful that he will be forgotten by his fellow Greeks. And this again ties in with the Iliad, book 23, when Patroclus visits him. He says to Achilles, "You have proved yourself to be forgetful of me, Achilles. Not while I lived did you take no heed of me." The Greek word is means having passed out of memory, been forgotten. And then, yeah, having take no care, take no heed of. So that passage, this passage again, when he suddenly pops up, is thinking back, you know, to the Homeric text and what the Homeric text says. And so we have this sacrifice of Polyxena, and this is meant to create a new memory for Achilles. This is going to ensure that Achilles is remembered. But what happens is that the decorous way in which she conducts herself before her execution, leaving everyone in tears, makes the memory all about her and not about him. And so Polyxena and her family become the subjects of the literary treatment of post-war Troy, the ones who will be remembered in the Greek tragic tradition once the war is over. And in this sense, Achilles is sidelined. Once you're dead, you can't make new memories for others to remember you by. They're just the old ones, basically. And so Polyxena appropriates the story, while Ovid leaves us with a single memory of Achilles as his account of the Trojan War closes, and that's the one that involves Hecuba. She's full of fury and hatred towards him. He's a monster in her eyes because of what he's done to her family. She says his buried ashes still rage against the family who have felt his hatred even from the grave. And this is the memory that stays with her even after her transformation into a wild dog, and it stays with the reader because it's precisely so emotionally powerful. So here we have this consideration of memory, and what we end those with the exact opposite of what Achilles was after. He wanted the respect and status he felt he was not being shown to him by his fellow Greeks, but instead it's the memory of someone else. He's the secondary character, and Polyxena is the primary character, basically. And then this then feeds back, if I may, sorry, I'm rambling on, I realize a little bit, to Aeschylus. We're back to this character again. He is someone who doesn't want to live in Troy. He lives in the countryside. Not only, and Ovid tells us, had he not hated cities, he may even have had a name that matched that of great Hector. But he didn't want that. He actually wants the opposite of memory. He wants oblivion because he accidentally caused the death of a nymph who was in love with Hesperia. So we start off with someone who doesn't want to be remembered. He doesn't want to be the Homeric hero like his brother. He wants to forget. And that's why he continually plunges into the sea to try and kill himself as a diver. But because he's been turned into a bird, he can't actually fulfill his desire and actually die. And so all of these things unpick this question of memory. They take the Homeric model and they look at it. They let you know that Ovid lets you know that he's read Homer and he's read Homer really well. And then he says, I'm going to look at all these questions and I'm going to think about them and I'm going to make you rethink everything that you believe you know about glory and the memory of someone after they die, basically. And with that, I will stop talking.
Oh my goodness, it's so interesting. And I do remember now what is the third thing I wanted to mention before, but I'm not going to say it yet. I'm going to wait until the end. But okay, so a few things. The preoccupation with death in the Iliad, I think, is partly showing us the difference between mortals and gods, and also between heroes and gods. And again, the mortal part of heroes dies, but the hero has an eternal spirit, like an eternal force, an eternal presence, potentially. And that goes to what does the word mean in an oral culture? And in a sense, um, every time you tell the story of the hero, you gather together and you tell the story of the hero in, especially right, if you're your local hero, you are invoking the hero in the present moment. So the hero is eternally um, invoked, eternally made present through the word. And this word kleos means specifically fame and song. It's having your name on people's lips. So the thing that is eternal about it is that every time you speak it, you give the hero his honors or her honors, then you're bringing the hero into the moment and you're enfolding yourself in this eternal moment as well. So you are also becoming part of eternity because you're doing what was done before and what will be done in the future. So yeah, Ovid has read Homer. He knows Homer really well. One of the questions that I have, and genuinely it's a question, what's happening to Greek traditions and the meaning of Homer in imperial Rome? So how is Ovid maybe thinking through what's happening to Greek traditions? And, what is this act of transforming them really about? I think is a really interesting question. Um, because the text itself, the Homeric text, in a way, is a cipher, right? It's a code. And you have to know how to read the signs in order to get the meaning. So you could read it on the level of the plot, the narrative, and not know anything about what it means, maybe to the archaic Greeks, right? In even how could we, any of us potentially claim to know? But of course, we do make, many educated theories, but that's a really interesting question for me, again, about the difference between orality and an oral culture and a literate culture is maybe even the power of the spoken word and what the word can achieve when it's participating in a ritual, right? A ritual moment where it's part of all these acts that are being done. Something else that I think is really that came into my mind as you were talking is the episode in the Aeneid when Aeneas encounters Andromache and she wants to talk about Hector. She wants to lament Hector. And Aeneas is like, sorry, I don't have time for this right now. And he keeps going. Um, so there's this, I feel like there's maybe some spirit of that in Ovid, right? Of like things keep moving forward. We keep moving forward in time. And yeah, I don't it's really, I mean, I have to say, really giving me a lot to think about with Ovid and what is exactly his engagement with the Homeric texts and then why he's skirting around the sacred texts.
I think,
It,
oh,
yeah.
sorry, carry on.
I was just going to say the one thing is also how at this time, if the Greeks feel like something sacred is being, is at risk, right? They're going to veil it, right? They're going to conceal it from you. And I wonder if there's an awareness of that, if there's an awareness that we're receiving a surface story, but it's very different from the deep story.
Yeah, I think so goodness, you've raised a lot of questions there. Um, I think there's actually I think so for one of your questions in terms of sort of the sort of how they deal with sort of the sort of Greek tradition. I think there's a message. I think there's a contemporary message in what Ovid's saying, which is a contemporary message for Imperial Rome, basically.
Mm.
So let's go back to the Aeneid in Book One, when Jupiter says, "I'm giving Rome mastery over all of time and space," right? The eternal glory of Rome, right?
Yeah.
Well, um, so what happens to Achilles, the way he's dealt with there, there's a sort of lesson there that actually is a distinct sort of political lesson. You know, don't don't assume, and this is something that runs through the entirety of the Metamorphoses. Don't assume that this eternal vision you have of an eternal city um, is going to actually come about. You know, Pythagoras in Book 15 talks about empires rising and falling, about
Mhm.
great Troy that's now ruins, right? Um, and the Greek city states that were once great kingdoms and are now nothing, right? And then he says, and then there's this other city that I hear is rising up, which is Rome, okay? And so the implication is that the eternal life or through memory or that one expects is not necessarily sort of guaranteed, I think. And then you have it will go to a Neronian epic poet Lucan. In his Pharsalia, there's a really famous episode there where Julius Caesar visits Troy and it's just ruins and it's covered in weeds and he's treading over all the ghosts of everybody and stuff. So there's those sorts of issues and questions that are sort of being raised, basically. Um, so yeah, and I think the one of the and talking about the power of the sort of the power of the spoken word and fame, right? Um, One of the really noticeable episodes in Ovid's treatment of the Trojan War is this digression on the Palace of Fame, right? The personification of fama in the Latin, which has a range of meanings. It can mean rumor, it can mean reputation, it can sort of mean storytelling. And it's in Book 12, and it literally happens right at the start of the war, basically. It's a meditation on poetic storytelling and commemoration, and it's placed strategically just before the greatest story of all, basically. And just to sort of talk about it a little bit, it doesn't really deal with. So in the Aeneid, you have fame as this sort of grotesque monster with multitude of eyes and ears and feathers and tongues, rather a gruesome beast. But here he focuses on the building, the palace, right, located in the center of the world, and it's a continual noise, and there's comings and goings, and so on and so forth, and low murmurs. And then fame sits at the top, and she looks out and surveys the whole world and sees the Greek fleet. They're on their way. Um, and so it's it's basically a digression that sort of is one of many that sort of explains the fundamental structures of the sort of poem. But it's also deals with how stories come and go and they're interpreted, they're reconstituted, they're fluid and dynamic. They can be retold in many different ways, really. And in a sense, it's sort of looking at that, what you say about kleos, but looking at it from a slightly different angle, really. And so I'm going to be a bit nerdy here. Okay, so pharma in the Latin is linguistically associated with fatum, fate, and they both come from the verb fari, which refers to fixed, formal speech that carries with it prophetic authority, well beyond normal modes of speaking. So these are two concepts, right? Fata and pharma, and they exist in Ovid's poem in a state of tension. On one side, they represent authoritative, ordered speech, and on the other side, the unpredictability, the multiplicity of language, the complications of storytelling, and the freedom that comes with storytelling and sort of a range of narrative voices, which is really exemplified in Ovid's poem because he doesn't just stick to the Homeric material. He picks up stuff from the epic cycle. He leans heavily on the tragic poets. Obviously, Virgil's a very, very important figure for him as well. And so this is at the heart of sort of Achilles' sort of fundamental dilemma, really. He has, his fate, his fatum, right, is a long life in obscurity or a short life that brings with it eternal glory, as told by the epic poets who will recount the deeds. But in Ovid, Achilles has no control over how those stories will be told. And in the end, it is Ovid who determines how he's seen by offering him a view mediated through the hatred of Hecuba. And it's also a question that's sort of relevant for the judgment of arms, right? So I'm just going to end on this point and then I'll. So Ulysses and Ajax, they basically try and persuade their peers to give them Achilles' armor, right? And they do so by constructing benign identities for themselves and denigrating the other person, right? But they use exactly the same stories, right? But they retell them in different ways to make them look like different people, right? And so it also touches on this theme of the malleability of storytelling, the the uncontrollability of one's reputation. It's not something that you're in charge of, basically. Uh, and it's anxiety inducing for Achilles. I would also say it feels to me sometimes there's a lot of anxiety in the characters of the Iliad. I stand to be corrected on that, but that's how I read it sometimes. The boastful pride that there seems to sort of betray a deep anxiety and a deep fear about imminent death and so on and so forth. So I think so much of what you say is really interesting because I think it touches on exactly sort of these issues, really. And I think it's really interesting to compare the two because you get these two perspectives on these really fundamental questions. And the two poems sort of engage with each other in really intelligent ways, I think, in that respect.
That does remind me also that when Achilles says, I would rather be alive,
Mm,
enslaved and ruling over enslaved people in the mortal world than a leader of the dead, or what exactly what he says. It is Odysseus who's telling us that.
mm,
So we have to wonder, is
mm,
Odysseus, is Odysseus, what is he, what is his agenda really in representing his stories the way that he does? And that gets exactly to your point, I think, of malleability of storytelling and the uncontrollability of one's reputation, because um, once your story is told by somebody else, then now they have control of how you're seen. I would say, though, that something else, because this comes up a lot as a question, what is a hero for the Greeks? And one of the things that I'm often saying is that it is a title in a sense. It means that you were alive in the age of myth, that you were descended from the gods, that you existed at a time when gods and mortals were in close communication, when they could communicate with each other more directly. and that you receive honor, that you're honored as such, as an eternal force by a local community. A local community has made you the object of ritual honors. So what you're remembered for isn't necessarily good or bad. It's potentially harmful or potentially beneficial, depending on what the perspective is. So I think I mean, again, that speaks exactly to what you're saying, the malleability of the story, like how the hero's story is told is going to differ depending on what one's perspective is in relation to that hero, and uncontrollability in the sense that some will say terrible things about you and others will say wonderful things about you. And in a way, you have to release that. That's not in the hero's control. That's not the hero's concern. That's the concern of the historical time in a way, right? That's outside the control of the hero, basically, is what I'm trying to say. So it is very interesting because in the end, I come away thinking, okay, so they were the same and they were different. Ovid and Homer were the same and they were different. Like it's like the great insight.
I
But
I I think that's probably true, actually. I think it's really
right.
light. I think didn't we, when we were preparing this, talk about oranges and avocados?
Yeah. Right, exactly. Exactly.
So they're both they're comparable in the sense they're both sort of things that you can eat, and they both provide sustenance, but they're also very different at the same time. And it's sort of really it's really fascinating. I think that what you have with Ovid, maybe you have that sense of uh, the heroic connection to a local community. I think this is actually something maybe that is to do with literacy as well. By the when you read the Metamorphoses, you don't get that sense of they're very much figures within a text, right? As opposed to sort
Yeah.
of existing beyond the text, I
Yeah.
think.
Mhm.
And they're also vehicles for the poet to sort of talk about themes that he wants to talk about and also engage with the inherited tradition.
Mhm.
Ovid ultimately is a poet. He wants to be recognized as the greatest poet of his generation. And to do that, you have to deal with everything that's come before that, right? And do it in a way that people sort of respect and so on and so forth. And so that's really, I think the poetry is with him, the poetry is always at the forefront, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
That's the greatest consideration for him. He wants to be that great poet, and so these names become literary figures, and he recognizes that basically. The Isaka story is all about who has a name, who doesn't have a name, who might have a name, and so on and so forth. So he sort of plays around. He plays around with that idea about sort of a person's reputation and the significance of a physical memorial for a person. um, that doesn't go to mean, though, just because Priam worships his tomb, but it's a false tomb in the sense that Isaacus is still alive. It doesn't mean to say that the memory of him or the emotions that Priam feels should be sort of dismissed or considered somehow second rate or anything like that. Those memories might be false, but they're still meaningful to the person, right? So Ovid, I think, talks about poetic memory, but he also uses this to talk about memory more generally in the way that we as individuals remember. And sometimes we have false memories, but those false memories are significant and they mean a lot to us. But that doesn't necessarily take away from the emotional response just because the memory is false, right? So there's that other thing to consider with him as well, I think.
Um, yeah, yeah, a lot. There's a lot there. And as you were talking, I started to think about the question of what is culture to the Greeks and what is culture in Imperial Rome. Um, and I think the culture to the Greeks is the continuity of the community, continuity of the traditions. You cannot rely, because it's such an unstable political climate, You
Mhm.
can't rely on the survival of buildings and monuments and right. The only thing that you can rely on is the spoken word in a way, right? And as long as you have survivors, you can carry on your culture. And that's, I think, different to what we think of as culture today. Or, I mean, you can tell me if it is or isn't different. I won't make any any claims about what it is to the Romans, but um, yeah, I think that that's a very integral element of how ancient Greeks, maybe we could imagine them defining culture. Um,
I think it's such a complicated word, isn't it?
it
Really.
really is. Yeah.
And I'd be loath to sort of make a statement sort of I can only really, I guess, I think in this sense, talk about Ovid really, because I think, you
Mhm.
know, his poem's unique. If you look at the Aeneid, then you're looking at something that's very different,
Mhm.
and so on and so forth. And so, sort of unpicking that question is quite a tricky one, I think. One that does bring me actually, it made me think a lot, really. This whole exercise has made me think a lot in terms of intertextuality, which is obviously something that's sort of really important when you study Ovid, the way he deals with the written tradition that he inherits. And
Mm.
the truth is, and I was thinking about this with the epic cycle, because it's really difficult to know what access he had to
Thank
those
you.
sort of poems, really. And I think whenever you think about a relationship between poets, it's very easy just to consider the stuff that we still have and forget about the stuff that's lost, right? And sort of all the intermediary stuff and all the intermediary sort of writers whose works haven't survived. We might not even know their names and so on and so forth who are writing. I mean, there's a very rich Roman tradition of tragedy, for instance, and you know, and we don't have very much of that. So I think working out, plotting a course from Homer to Ovid is really tricky because you
Mhm.
don't know what
Yeah.
the stops are sort of in between, really.
Mhm.
Um, and sometimes you can see immediate connections, and then other times you think, well, maybe, especially with the epic cycle. I mean, these are stories that appear in the epic cycle, but maybe they're also stories that appeared elsewhere, but we don't have those texts, and we don't have and they're sort of very strong illusions that we're just not aware of because we don't have the text that they come from, and so on and so forth. So that's a really important aspect of literacy, I think, as well, when you think about Ovid, is that it's a very much an incomplete picture,
Mhm.
and trying to plot the traces of influence is really tricky, I think.
Yeah, and that also it just worth mentioning the idea that you could write things down, make them visible, make them manifest for future generations. It's still so relatively new in classical Greece that it's hard to, right? So one of the things that I think about a lot is, well, what did Sophocles and Euripides and all the other tragedians, Aristophanes, the all of these playwrights, what did they think the life cycle of their work was going to be? What were they doing their work for, in a way? Is it, to what extent are they thinking about the future life of their work? I mean, it would be written down, there would be a record of it. Some tragedies were produced again, but it's a very interesting question that I think I really want to stay in this space of the incomplete picture because that's something that I say a lot, even though I will give a sense of what I think the ancient Greek culture, like what this word means to them, means to Greeks, means to people who live in very unstable times. Uh, yeah, I think this idea that we have an incomplete picture is really important, actually.
Yeah, I'll just sort of jump in there. I'm seeing there's quite a lot of, well, I'm not looking at the chat, but there seems to be a lot of activity on it. It's interesting because at the end of the Ovid's Metamorphoses, he talks about his own reputation, he talks about his own fame, you know, and he talks defiantly about how he will survive, and he will be, he describes his own astral apotheosis, basically. He survive as a poet, then he'll be his own reputation will spread around the globe, and in a sense, he's absolutely right because it has done.
Mm,
Now that segment at the very end is believed to have been written from exile when he was powerless. I think I talked about this the last time.
mm,
And so you can also argue that actually it betrays a deep anxiety about being forgotten,
mm,
and so on and so forth. So that sort of issue, that sort of issue about that you're talking about there, about uh, how are future generations going to remember me, is a really important one. And then I think Ovid must be aware that he is part of that process for others, right? How how is Euripides going to be remembered? Well, Ovid's rewriting of Euripides is part of that whole dynamic of Euripides being remembered, and so on and so forth.
mhm,
So I
mhm.
think there's a very interesting sense of him being part of a chain or a dynamic process, and this is exemplified by the Palace of Fame as he describes it, this sort of constant toing and froing and sort of activity, constant activity and noise. Um, it sort of talks to this idea of a literary tradition that's dynamic and fluid and continually changing.
And Zoe has a really interesting comment in the chat. What I always wonder is what writers left out because they thought, well, everyone knows this, so I'm not going to bother writing that. I think that's actually so important because we
Mm.
do. I read a very long and complex article on the myth of Pandrosos that I think Penelope mentions in her prayer to Artemis. I think that's the one, but I might be getting the myth wrong, so please feel free to correct me, anybody who is seeing this in future time as well. Um, but there is a moment, right? There's a long, and there's this question, is it that would the audiences have known this? Would people who were here, and who were the, right, which audiences, like who would have known this? What's going on here? Uh, yeah. Um, yeah. Thank you for
Yeah.
joining us, Martin. Happy to have you. So yeah, a wonderful question. I think a very important question, Zoe, that you bring up. And then like in the Polish dictionary of, what does this say? Meme, fame, horse. Everyone knows what a horse is. Um,
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that question is really relevant actually, because we're sort of talking about all of this in sort of slightly in an academic environment and so on and so forth. But the reality is that poetry is also a trade, right? And when you write down, right, I've got to treat the Trojan War now. Okay, well, I can't just do a straight up account of that because that's been done. That's probably been done by lots of people. So I'm going to have to do something new. So there's there's the consideration of how someone wants to explore the themes, and then there's the sort of basic consideration of the technicalities of it. I've got to now deal with this big beast of a story, and how am I going to do that, and how am I going to make that interesting for people so that they don't think they're just reading another treatment of the Trojan War, of which, Horace's art of poetry is indicative or suggests that there were probably a lot of these versions around. A lot of people were writing their own epic poems about the Trojan War, and probably a lot of them weren't very good.
right. And, maybe likewise, or also in Athens, if poets are also educators, then and they're trying to invoke the gods and heroes, they're trying to educate us in our time, maybe thinking about how are these things that are happening, how do I need to take what is happening right now in the present and incorporate it in the way that I retell this myth. There's a lot of sometimes in tragedy, you'll
Mm.
get that kind of double vision where it's talking about a myth, but we also know that it's somehow interacting with what's happening in the polis of Athens at this time.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And as I sort of said before, I think this whole idea about Achilles and Achilles' memory is really, really relevant for Imperial Rome and for
Mm.
an emperor who was moving towards a divine representation of themselves, basically.
Yeah, we haven't even touched
Shifting,
on.
yeah,
Mm.
I mean, shifting from being a Roman magistrate amongst many to being something sort of along the lines of a sort of Hellenistic sort of king, god king
Yeah.
type figure. So yeah, no, that's I think that's really interesting. And one of the things about the Metamorphoses, I think, is it's very contemporary in lots of respects, but it's very difficult for a modern reader to identify those contemporary features. But you know, for instance, Ajax and Ulysses, their speeches are
Thank
sort
you for
of
doing this.
speak to
Headlines.
speak to you know, sort of the Roman tradition of sort of taking two sides of an argument and so on and so forth, sort of a rhetorical practice. So so it is a very contemporary poem in lots of respects, I think, and has lots of things to say about sort of
Mm.
the contemporary world in which it was written.
Mm. I do want to give anyone else a chance if anyone has any questions or any observations, thoughts, reflections, meditations. I could throw out a few more words, but mm. I mean, I could talk about this endlessly. I do think it's really fascinating, and I'm I do find the two epics, the two big epics, Aeneid and Metamorphoses, very, very compelling and interesting to think with. I do think, like you said, I think they also have, I think they're more relatable in our time as well. I think it's just difficult maybe to, it's funny, we were talking this morning in Greek about the perfect tense and the imperfect tense, and in Greek, in ancient Greek. And the perfect tense is past continuous that has a bearing on the present. And imperfect is past continuous, but past, right? So why the need for this specificity? And how did this even, I started thinking this morning, how did that even occur? Like how was this possible when they didn't have even grammarians really that we know of, right? That there wasn't somebody sitting around saying, we'll make a perfect tense and we'll make an, but somehow this is coming out in the way that they're speaking. And it feels really significant to me. But stop, I know we're all scared. The aurist is just terrifying. But the point that I'm trying to make is I think one of the things we said in class was, well, that's a degree of precision we don't have in English. And so it's really difficult for us even to talk about it. How do we talk about it when we don't have something necessarily that we're as focused on the need for that kind of differentiation?
Mm.
And I think that's part of the issue too with the epic with the epics of Homer. It's like we can just accept them as narratives and deal with them as narratives. I think they become so much personally. I think they become so much more intriguing when you look at that deep meaning, uh, because you start to realize like, oh, this is a really different way of looking at the world than what we're doing, what we're seeing maybe later.
And
But
also the stories still have a relevance really, and I think it's the task of sort of the academic world to sort of you know bang the drum for the relevance that they have. I mean, you know, take for example, I mentioned Chaos on Netflix. You know, that was a fabulous show that was very Ovidian in lots of respects, and it was. You know, there's this interest still in these stories. I mean, Christopher Nolan's gonna drop the Odyssey again next year, you know, with Matt Damon as Odysseus and so on and so forth. So, you know, how many times has that story been told? But yet, one of the great directors, filmmakers of our generation has decided that he feels he needs to make that story. He needs to retell that story. So there's a relevance there really, and it just needs unpicking, to be honest. And and that's sort of one of the sort of joys of today, I guess, is sort of working through these two very different poems and finding how they sort of lead to similar places, I think.
And different places at the same time, I
Yeah,
think.
yeah.
Because I keep thinking about a conversation that Freddie and I had earlier, where I was saying one of the things that if I were to say something maybe rubs me the wrong way, right? I think is a good analogy is when the figure of Zeus and the figure of Jupiter are sort of treated like there's just Zeus, Jupiter, Zeus slash Jupiter, when they're really very different, right?
Mm.
Ovid's Jupiter is different from Virgil's Jupiter, and Virgil and Ovid's Jupiters are different from Homer's Zeus. And I don't know. I started the third thing that I had taken away that I did set out. I'll mention it at the end is I started to wonder, is Homer talking about the ideal, like the ideal functioning of the cosmos, and Ovid, or what he imagines to be the ideal functioning of the cosmos, which is everything is in balance, nothing overrides the other, right? Everybody's honored as is appropriate. And Ovid is kind of talking about the reality. Like that was just a little thought that came to me as I was listening to you. Um, because I do think a lot of times we think about Ovid's Jupiter, especially that episode with Io, and Io, Juno and Jupiter from book one.
Mhm.
And we think, oh, Hera's jealous, right? And we kind of make her like a kind of shrewish, jealous wife. Whereas in the Iliad, I think she's like, you will show me my honor. Like, I have the same genealogy as you, which is the same thing that Poseidon uses in his, in his agons, his debates with Zeus is don't forget, I have the same genealogy. I have power too, and you would be wise to respect that. And Zeus knows when to concede and when to push back. And again, the death of Sarpedon, one of the reasons that's such an super important episode is it's because it's the father, the Anax, the leader of the gods saying, okay, I get it. I can't just make my will more important than anybody else's because that's going to cause problems. So that's again the ideal, right? The ideal is everybody's power is honored and put into some sort of appropriate balance. And that again is really different from like the absurdity of Jupiter hiding, turning Io into a cow and then giving her as a gift to his wife, like
Yeah, no, the Jupiter. I mean, it's a very human, oh, not a human Jupiter. It's a very, yeah, the gods in the Metamorphoses, they're these sorts of superhumans, but they're sort of very flawed individuals. And Jupiter's completely uh, taken away from, he doesn't have that close relationship with fate that he has in these other poems, basically. He's subject to it. Um, and they are these individuals who are superhuman in lots of respects, capable of extreme violence, um, almost bored with life, really, until they sort of retreat. They're not part they're not part of the fundamental infrastructure of the cosmological infrastructure of Ovid's world in any meaningful way. Um, they are a source of conflict, essentially. It's a quite a dystopian world, Ovid's world, and there isn't balance. There's a state of tension continually between stasis and flow, sort of concourse discordia, I think it is in book one. So stasis and flow constantly sort of at each other, and you can sort of see it in the sort of palace of fame. Really, you've got this sort of building that is a permanent structure, and yet there's lots of dynamism that goes on within it, for instance. And so that tension's never resolved, really. It's not a life affirming world that Ovid presents us with, I don't think.
And I'll just mention Zoe's other comment because I think also very important. Maybe we tell the stories in the way we are reflected in them, I think that's quite so. Doesn't matter what's right, it's the meaning behind the stories. Um,
That's how stories, I think Zoe's absolutely right. That's how stories survive. If they're not meaningful for us now, if
mm,
people read the Metamorphoses and they don't find anything that they can relate to in that poem, then what's the point of reading it, right?
mm.
And the myths generally, this aspect of relevance, it's sort of, they have to say something, and I think they still do because they deal with fundamental questions. They deal with questions of power, questions of violence and cruelty, um, family relationships, and so on and so forth. They speak to what it's like to be human, and
I
and
agree.
we're still humans, and so
One small thing that I'll push back on though, just a little, just a little
go
bit,
ahead. No, no, absolutely.
is that we do also want to recognize that they might be saying things more than just what we see in them, right? So,
Hmm.
and
Yeah, sure.
so we don't want to just reduce them, right? While I 100% agree with what Zoe's saying, right? We tell the stories the way that we are reflected in them. We also want to bring all the different reflections together in a dialogue because I think that that dialogue is where the wisdom can come out as well. So, for example, I would say this dialogue was really important, even just for recognizing what can Ovid give us that's different from what Homer can give us, and how we're both equally valuable and important
Yeah, I mean that's why the
use
myths
of
are
the
so
language.
interesting because they're so layered in the way that you just described, and there's a complexity to them. They don't provide you with easy answers, right? You have to sort of start look. You have to look for them, and so that's part of why they've endured, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And why there's still again, I will just take the Greek dialogue and bring that back. Why is that always so important? And Zoe also and Andy, couple comments. Culture change. Andy says culture changes over time, but human emotions remain the same. I mean, absolutely. And
Exactly.
Zoe, that's what struck me about Sappho, the fact that the emotions were the same. Right. Right. That you can see these words. And I think with Sappho, one of the powerful thing, you just see 5 words in a line and you're like, how can this resonate so deeply? And yet it does. And you feel the power in those words. And I think that's it's part of what's so incredible. And yeah, it's we're enriched by hearing more and then being able to see the differences as well as the similarities, because that's also something we do have to deal with in real life as well, right? How many times do we
Hmm.
think we know what somebody's saying and then we realize like, oh, I didn't understand that what they said at all. Very humbling, but in a good way, right?
Hmm. No,
Oh,
absolutely. Or you think, well, they may have meant this, or they could have meant that, or what were
right.
they actually saying? Maybe they weren't saying anything at all.
Yeah.
No, absolutely.
And I'll just
Absolutely.
say that right, the word hermeneutics and its connection to the god Hermes comes to mind, right? So
Yeah, well, there you go.
um uh, wow. I'm gonna stop the recording now. Just oh God, I almost ended the meeting. That's one of my little tricks.